The Mindfulness and Grief podcast offers compassionate insights for coping with grief and life after loss. I'm your host, Heather Stagg. Welcome to episode 3, Ahimsa and the Yogic Path to Self-Care Through Grief. Today's guest is Karla Helbert, who is a licensed professional counselor in Virginia and the author of the book, Yoga for Grief and Loss, among other wonderful books. And Karla has an upcoming book on the chakra system for grief and trauma, which we'll talk about a little later in the episode. But welcome, Karla. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me, Heather.
So I thought it might be interesting to just start by sharing how your grief experience led you to offer these teachings to your clients and to the people who read your book.
Well, I am a therapist, as you mentioned, and I have been for some time. My son died of a brain tumor in 2006, and he was a baby. So he was 9 months old when he died. And I was a therapist at that time. And it's interesting to me, like it's kind of, I don't know if interesting is the right word, but in graduate school, grief and bereavement has always been an area of interest to me. I was a hospice volunteer in college, and I took a semester-long elective course in counseling and death and dying and grief and bereavement. But when this happened to me, I had like no idea how to deal with it. It's life-changing. And of course, so it's also traumatic grief, which I didn't know at the time. And it's interesting because a lot of my clients now talk about how that's one of the most helpful things for them is to recognize that what they're going through is traumatic, and they've been through trauma and they have post-traumatic stress around it, and it's part of the path. And I didn't realize that at the time either. And so it's this, when you are in the middle of a loss that just shatters your entire universe, you don't know what to do. And honestly, a friend of mine actually said, I'll never forget it. He was dying. My son was dying, but still alive. And she said, oh, now you're going to be a grief therapist. And I just was shocked. I just thought, oh my God, I said, I don't have any idea what to even do to help myself. Like how would I help anybody else? But eventually what happened is I just started taking training after training after training because I was searching for something to help me figure out how to get through this. And even though the grief theory is fabulous and I learned a lot of stuff and learning is a good thing, still it was my direct experience, which in yoga, that's a really important concept, is your direct experience is your greatest teacher. There was nothing that really can prepare anybody, and it's just moving through it. And what I learned, and the research also supports this, is that the people who do the best, right, have good support and they have good self-care. And that's really hard sometimes to muster, and it's hard to find support often for grieving people because you're so isolated, and the culture that we happen to live in is not very hospitable to grieving people. And so it can be really difficult to find those things that really help you move through this in a healthy way. So anyway, it just was more training and more training. And I'm also a yoga teacher and was before. I did my yoga training in 2002. And so the concepts of yoga and the teachings really helped me at his diagnosis and through the illness. But after he died, it's like all that fell away too. And it took me a couple of years of just being in this really like the dark night of the soul space, and of nothing was helpful, and yoga wasn't helpful. But then I realized after I looked back, I was practicing the concepts and the teachings and the branches of yoga without having realized it, which is what the book is about. It's not really about that, but the book, the Yoga for Grief and Loss book, each chapter discusses a different branch of yoga and how that particular branch is ideally suited to help people move through grief. And so now, like once you've lived with traumatic grief and it's part of your life, it's like that lens is how you see everything. And it's how I still see everything. And of course, it's very much present in my life every single day, with grieving people that I work with. But it's also still my grief is still part of my life all the time. And so I'm always still seeing that. But the book is about the concepts of yoga and how specifically they help support people through trauma and grief. And it's the book I really wish that I could have given myself at the time, but I can't go back in time. But right. I realized that's what was happening, that yoga really did help me move through it, even when I didn't realize that that's what was going on.
And so I think this might be a good time to talk about those limbs of yoga, because so many people think of yoga, or it's just presented as a physical practice, a place where we go to either stretch or sweat, that it's very body-based, which it is, but then there are also these aspects of yoga that don't always get talked about in your normal yoga class, and that's the whole philosophy of yoga. And I didn't mention you're a yoga therapist, as am I, certified yoga therapist. And so we use not just the physical practice of yoga, but these limbs of yoga, these ways of thinking and being to help people work through whatever is presenting. And you and I both work in this field of grief. So maybe we could touch lightly on the limbs of yoga, but I know that you wanted to share one particular aspect of that today, which is Ahimsa, to help people with self-care. And we'll detail that in a moment. So maybe let's just discuss those limbs to start with, the philosophy of yoga.
Yeah. Well, I mentioned the branches a second ago, so I'll just really quickly differentiate with those. So the branches of yoga are different from the limbs. It's all a big tree, right?
Right. Yes, I'm getting micro.
Yeah. Well, the limbs are a thing, and they're part of one of the branches of yoga called Raja Yoga. But then, so asana, which is the body movements of yoga, the poses, are part of two different branches of yoga, and one of them is the Raja Yoga and the other is Hatha Yoga. And Hatha Yoga is anything that has to do with the physical body, basically. And Raja Yoga is also talked about as the science of yoga, and it contains the limbs, which are these 8 limbs. So Patanjali, who is the writer of the Yoga Sutras, and we're not sure, if it was one person or multiple people or who he really was, but he put together these aphorisms of yoga that ended up being the sutras. And as part of that book, which is the text really for Raja Yoga, contains the limbs, and it ultimately leads to a state called samadhi, which is this ultimate state of realization and bliss, and is followed after meditation. So it's this path to meditation that leads to this state of realization. So anyway, but the other branches are things that help us cultivate devotion, help us to deal with the questions in our minds. There's a path of an intellect called Jnana Yoga. There's the path of the heart, which is Bhakti Yoga. There's Tantra Yoga, which really is focused on sensuality and also ritual very heavily, understanding that the divine is present in the mundane, which is every single thing that we do all day long, and in nature as well. And then there's Karma Yoga, which has to do with selfless service and volunteerism. And all of the branches of yoga ultimately lead to the goal of yoga, which is the word itself, which means union. So it's this union of body, mind, and spirit, but also finally with something much larger than ourselves. And in my mind, so the thing that's much larger than yourself is very individual. So if you're a religious person, that might be God. If you're not a religious person, it might be the universe, or it could be community, or it could be the planet. My take on it is it's very personal and individual what this union is for you. But regardless, yoga leads you to that space no matter what branch you choose. And within the branch of Raja Yoga, you have those 8 limbs.
And so right there you have something that's really supportive of grief work, because grief is a fracturing experience.
Yeah.
We often say it shatters your assumptive worldview. It makes you feel like you have been ripped apart inside, physically, emotionally, spiritually. And so just acknowledging that the word yoga does mean union. It is a coming back together. It makes perfect sense that this would be a wise path to take.
Absolutely. And the thing about yoga, like yoga says, it's okay if you don't feel like you're connected. And it's okay if you don't believe that, because yoga just does it anyway. And it helps us. It's just knowing that the purpose and being on the path is that one day that we'll hopefully find that space. And if you have these moments, these like little moments of connection, then yoga helps you to find those. And within those moments is where we can go, oh, okay, if I can feel this for this moment, then I can experience that again. And it helps us to remember, like literally bring ourselves back together from trauma and grief. But it also says to us, in a spiritual perspective, that our loved ones who we feel have been totally separated from us are not. And how can we also have that joining with them, that connection with them? Because as a grieving person, I mean, for me too, the concept of having to think about saying goodbye or having closure, which is not a thing, was horrible. Why would I want to do that? You don't stop having a relationship with this person that you love. And the practices of yoga continue to help you to have those continuing bonds and to maintain and grow the relationship even after death. And those are the things that yoga can help us do, and in the multiple branches in it and within the limbs. Yeah. So yes, it's ideal for helping grieving people move through the shattered world that is now your reality.
And for so many of us, my experience, probably your experience, and most people who are watching or listening to this, we can be really tough on ourselves when we are grieving. Sometimes our worst enemy is our own negative self-talk about, how I should be doing better. Or I talk to so many people where around that, 90-day mark or 100-day mark, when a lot of the friends and family that have been supportive go home, go back to work, stop calling as much, right when you're plummeting, and you feel like, why am I not doing better?
Absolutely.
And so there's one particular, there's many things in yoga that can help, but, that principle of Ahimsa, which in yoga means nonviolence, can help us support ourselves. So can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah. So Ahimsa, which, as you said, means nonviolence, also can be interpreted to mean non-harm, is one of the limbs of yoga, and so of which there are 8. So yama and niyama are the first 2, and those 2 really have to do with our behavior and our treatment of ourselves and others. And the yamas, which is a Sanskrit word that means control or restraint, these are things that we are to cease from doing in our lives. So when you have the interpretation of the words, it's like non-harm, non-lying, non-stealing, all these things, you don't do that stuff. And then the niyamas are things that we cultivate. And there's 5 each of the yamas and niyamas. And so those are the first 2 limbs. But really there's 10 things. And then
there's a lot of numbers, and it,
I know, it's so
and
true.
If you're listening to this, there will not be a test.
No test. And it's a lot of information, and it can get confusing, which is why we were going to really talk about just the one.
Right.
So really quickly, I'm going to just say the 8 ones. And so the third one is asana, which is the body and the poses. And then it's breath work. So it's pranayama, the breathing. And then the next one is concentration. And the next one is meditation. Well, no, sorry, sense withdrawal. It's pratyahara. That comes after the breathing. And then is concentration. And then is meditation. And then it's samadhi, which is the state of realization and blissfulness. And in the Yoga Sutras, it doesn't say oh, you have to, it says you do these things for a long time. You practice without break for a long time and with a whole heart. And Patanjali doesn't say, oh, you have to do this. He says, just try it. Like if you try these things and you'll see what your experience is and see how you feel. So anyway, back to the very first one, which is the yamas. And then of those 5 yamas, the things that we don't do, and this is to have a more useful life and a peaceful life. The first one is ahimsa, which is non-harm. And I'm sure I was taught this in my yoga teacher training initially, but when I was writing the book, I had this like epiphany, like I understood it in this whole new way. They're in order. And so all of the limbs grow from this one little seed, the very first thing, the first yama of ahimsa, which is non-harm. And often the interpretation of that when you talk to teachers is it's nonviolence and it's non-harm. And so that's often seen as the harm that we cause others. So people who choose to be vegan and who are vegetarian are doing these things to not harm animals or to not harm the earth. So I have some friends who are their focus is on helping the earth. And so really the best way you can help the earth is to stop eating meat, because the production of meat is very harmful to the environment. And other people don't do it because they don't want to harm the animals. And so a lot of the non-harming is seen in terms of your behavior towards others and not hurting other people or other beings. But in terms of grief often, and this can translate to, are you hurting other people in your life? But looking at yourself. And as I had said a little bit earlier to you when we were just chatting before, talking about Iyengar, who is a renowned yoga teacher. So BKS Iyengar, and this is one of my favorite books, Tree of Yoga. But one of the greatest quotes in here, he says, why do you think of the violence of the world? Why don't you think of the violence in you? Because it all starts with us. And so many people in grief, as you just mentioned, just beat themselves up all the time, metaphorically, sometimes literally, and feel I should be doing better. I should be, I should not feel this way. And the way you feel is absolutely natural and normal. And if we can stop, and often the simplest teaching that I share with everybody who works with me is, can you just stop at any given moment in your grief and just close your eyes and go within and put your hand on your heart and maybe the other hand on your belly, or you can cross your hands over your heart and just get in touch with your heart and how you're feeling, and just say, what is the most compassionate thing I can do for myself right now? And can you do that thing? And sometimes the most compassionate thing for yourself in the moment isn't, the most easy thing to do. It could be, I need to just go take a nap. Or it could be, maybe I should go get a massage because I'm so stressed and so tense. Or maybe I just need to go for a walk. Or maybe it's I need to really tackle this stack of work over here because it's going to keep piling up and I'm going to feel more stressed about it. That would be the most compassionate thing. So it's in every given moment. What can you do right now that is the most compassionate thing for yourself? And when it starts happening is the more you're compassionate towards yourself, then the more you can have that compassion for others. So looking at, not harming other people, as Iyengar says, what kind of violence are you doing to yourself? And maybe that's mental, maybe it's something behavioral. I totally, and I don't want to make this about, bad behavior choices or, poor avoidance things, or avoiding grief by drinking too much or eating too much, because it's not about that. But sometimes you might need to stop and say, okay, is this harmful for me in the long run? And looking at it and just trying to take that moment of compassion. Or when it's a mental process of just telling yourself, I shouldn't still be feeling like this. Well, but you do. You do feel like that. And what if this was you were talking to your best friend or somebody that you love deeply, and they're telling you, I shouldn't feel this way. Oh, I should be doing better. What would you say to them? Would you be like, oh, yeah, you really are doing bad. You should really. Now, there are some friends who talk like that to people, but
they don't stay friends long, do they?
No, they don't. But that's another podcast.
It is another podcast. But sometimes we do, put up with behavior from ourselves that we wouldn't put up with from other people.
That's right.
And vice versa. And so that's not to to shame or blame any of us who do that, because I'm definitely a member of that club.
Absolutely.
I mean, that's why I practice is to work with my own inner world, my own inner landscape. And I know, in going through my experiences of grief, even what you were saying in the beginning, even with all the knowledge and the study and the academia and the grief theory, we're still human, and we still have a very human grief experience.
Absolutely.
And I even find that with some grief professionals, myself included, when we are faced with grief, we can be even harder on ourselves because we think, I have all this intellectual knowledge, I should know. But that's not real.
No,
and that's harming ourselves. And
yes,
so,
or gauge it by time, like how much time has passed.
Right.
And so it's been, my son died in 2006, so it's been like 12 and a half years. Well, right? Yeah, 12 years. Yes, 12 and a half years. And probably 2 years ago, so around 10 years, Christmas is very difficult for a lot of people, and for me as well. And I was in the kitchen just like crying, like 10 years ago. And my husband was just sitting there with me, and I was crying, and I was just like so upset. And I said, I shouldn't still feel this way. And I just stopped, and I was like, oh my God, I can't believe I just said that.
Right.
Because what would I say to somebody who was sitting across from me saying those things? It doesn't matter that it's been 10 years or 3 years or 15 years or 20. It makes no difference. It's what you feel right now.
Yeah. And
you're allowed to feel all those things. And actually just last week, and I won't go into a bunch of details because it just takes up time, but I was having a really griefy moment, and I had just dropped my daughter, who's 10, off at camp, and I was sitting in the parking lot crying and feeling really awful. And I just thought, oh God, I just shouldn't be feeling like this, and irritated with myself for feeling this way. And then I just stopped, and I was like, you know what? This is a practice, like you just said. This is not a perfect, and it's a constant practice. And I just stopped, and I just said, okay, I'm just going to let myself feel this way. I mean, I understand where it's coming from. Intellectually, I get like what's going on, but it doesn't stop the feelings. And so I just sat there and I just cried for like, what, I don't know, it was like 5-10 minutes. And then I just breathed and I went on. And I had sort of a crappy day the whole day, but it was fine, because I practiced being kind to myself and allowing myself to feel what I felt. And that made me feel better just by doing that.
Yeah. You treated yourself as you would treat a client or your best friend or your child. And that is really, I think, that's the heart of Ahimsa. And it is a practice. I think with many spiritual practices, we think it's kind of like penicillin, where you take it for 5 or 7 days and then you're cured of all your troubles. And that's just not the case. That's not real. That's not true for any of us. It's a lifelong thing.
Mm-hmm. And I love, so if we had more time to go into all of the yamas and the niyamas and then Ahimsa and how all of those things sort of flow and build on each other, but to come back to the foundation of all of it really is Ahimsa. And I think that it's such a simple practice, but it's not easy to do. And if you look at, how you're treating yourself, what you're saying to yourself, your behavior towards yourself, and then also how that translates into the world and other people that you interact with, it all, like, if you can just stop and be kind towards yourself and compassionate and see how that impacts your feelings and your thoughts, and what happens when you just shift one tiny thing towards yourself, instead of saying mean things and, oh, I shouldn't be this way, or whatever the shoulds are, or the should nots. What happens when you do that is you're arguing with the reality of what is right now in this moment. And to continue to do that is not kind. And it tends to just reinforce the mean things that we're saying to ourselves. And if you can just stop for one moment and just practice the concept of Ahimsa, and however it looks in that moment, and watch what happens to your thoughts and watch what happens to your feelings, you can really notice a difference. there's a softening around the heart and maybe even in the body of how you're holding yourself. Instead of the tension, it's sort of, okay, can I just relax into this? And it feels very different.
Yeah.
And it seems so simple, but it's so not easy to do.
And so when you talked about that, it made me think of the mindfulness practice of RAIN. That's an acronym, and a lot of meditation teachers teach it. Sharon Salzberg, Tara Brach, myself, but where it's really the idea of turning into the suffering, turning towards the pain, rather than trying to numb it or trying to feed it. It's just allowing it, giving it some space, which I really think that practice is a radical act of self-compassion and care. It's letting yourself be. It's not going in and meddling with it even. It's not even fixing it. And so often, I think socially, in this world we live in, it's expected that you fix your grief. Like, you're doing really well, you're really strong, she's not crying anymore. Like those things are rewarded, which reinforces that idea that grief is pathological when it's in fact natural. And so, just listening to you talk about that and thinking about how we each have our own very unique experience of loss based on who we lost, the relationship, the level of attachment. There's so many things that feed into that are so unique. And grief is also universal at the same time.
Yes.
Which is so interesting. It's such a, special and global.
Absolutely. It's true. And it's interesting. So earlier we were talking about having support, and that is definitely one of the things that helps people move through this more easily, and it helps us all. But what's interesting is what you're saying is how there's a universality around grief. And so I'm a bereaved parent, and I talk to a lot of bereaved parents, and we all often talk about how when you meet another person, as soon as you find out that they're also a bereaved parent, there's this immediate connection. You just know, oh, this person knows. But at the same time, the stories are so different. Even with my husband, who we lost the same child, there is nobody else who lost him the way I lost him. And there's nobody who can know my internal experience. And that's true for us all. There's nobody who can understand your exact experience. And that in itself is isolating. And in many ways, this is something we do alone, even when we're doing it together. And it really requires kindness towards ourselves. It's just this overwhelming experience that if you can make it a tiny bit easier on yourself by being kind, you notice the difference. But then what you're saying about culture could learn a few things about Ahimsa as well around grieving people, because those ideas of, well, oh, you're doing so well, and this notion of something is good or something is bad. It's like if somebody comes in the office and, oh, I'm having a good week. Well, what does that mean? That almost always means they're not crying as much. They're smiling more. They're interacting with people more, which are not bad things, right? It's, again, it's good or bad. But then it qualifies, oh, you're doing well and you're having a good week because these things are happening, which then automatically, if you're having a bad week, it means, oh, I'm crying a lot this week and I'm having a hard time, getting to work this week. And that's bad. And so then the messages of the world are also playing in our own minds, and it seeps in. And then we think that's true. And those things aren't true. Yeah. And it just makes things so much more difficult. It would be nice if the rest of the world could just say, oh, well, you're feeling sad today. That's okay. Just go ahead and feel sad. But, then we'd have to talk about the discomfort of other people being in the presence of pain that they can't fix. And that's another podcast.
Right. Yeah. And, sometimes self-compassion or non-harm is very much tied to who you surround yourself with. And we often talk about how, grief changes your your address book, how your landscape of friends changes. And so sometimes it is about choosing to step away from people who are toxic or harmful. Or I heard this wonderful woman, Vicky Calzetti, who gave a keynote at the National Fallen Firefighters Foundation Wellness Conference. She's a bereaved mother, and she talks about how her best friend, when her child drowned, just didn't do grief well, like did not show up. But Vicky made the choice. Do I want to have compassion for my friend who doesn't know what to do, or do I want to suffer another loss? And that was her choice. And they're still friends. Like, I think it's been 25 or 35 years of just being like, well, okay, I'm not going to get what I need from her right now because she can't walk in my shoes right now. And that's not to say there's a right or wrong way. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it is stepping away from people who aren't helpful. Sometimes it's saying, well, I'm going to let you kind of hang out over here for now, and we'll reconnect later.
That comes up a lot in my practice with people.
Yeah.
And you do have to look at each of those relationships individually.
Yeah.
And say, okay, how much harm is this relationship causing me?
Yeah.
But how much do I want to keep this relationship in my life? And you have to find a balance there. And sometimes the answer is, I want to keep this relationship, but right now it's harmful, so I'm going to have some space from it. And it's individual with every single person, because it comes up a lot. These things come up in workshops and retreats and groups, and there's no easy answer, because the individual relationship and what you receive from it, how important it is to you, how much you need it or want it in your life, and then how harmful it is in this moment it's individual, and it has to be measured all the time. And if those people are family, for example, which this happens a lot, then you may decide to take some space for a while. And then when you're stronger and you've been more kind to yourself, you're able to say, okay, exactly what Vicky said. I understand now, this many years later, this person is not capable of giving me what I need. And I still love them. And so I can have a relationship with them on some different terms. But then there are other people you can just say, you know what, I don't need that in my life. It's absolutely toxic. It's harmful to me. And the most compassionate thing for me is to say no. And then you don't have a relationship with that person. Yeah. It's this ongoing process all the time. And that's with Ahimsa. It's every moment. You can be practicing a new form of Ahimsa toward yourself or toward the earth and toward people, toward others that you love. It's this ongoing thing. It's every moment of every day.
Yeah. So for people who are listening and are really interested in bringing Ahimsa into their life, do you have some practical tips for, because saying be kind to yourself can be really hard for those of us with decades of self-criticism and self-blame, especially when we don't have a lot of energy during grief. But are there some maybe simple but knowingly not easy?
Oh, yeah. Well, so many, as you know, so many of these practices are simple, very, very simple, but never really easy. And so, the one thing is that practice of, first you have to notice. So there's the mindfulness piece of it. And, everything I teach and talk about comes back to meditation often, having this practice of meditation, because having a regular meditation practice helps to increase your ability to be aware of your thoughts, not when you're not meditating. So you have your practice. Let's just say that you practice meditation for 10 minutes a day. So for that 10 minutes, you're practicing whatever form of meditation you're practicing. For the rest of the time, you're not really practicing, but the benefit you get from that helps you to increase your ability to be aware of the stuff you're saying to yourself, the things that are going on. So I would say, to help prepare for dealing with moments like this, for people to have a regular meditation practice. And some people that I work with will start really at 2 minutes. Can you do this for 2 minutes?
Right.
And obviously, often the easiest thing to do is to start with your breath, just noticing the breath coming in and out. When I work with people with meditation, we do lots of different ways of practicing and finding the thing that works for you. And when you find that thing, then, do it. And when you don't do it, don't beat yourself up about it. Just say, okay, I'm going to start again tomorrow, and have this beginner's mind, right? Every day, I'm going to start again tomorrow. And that's Ahimsa right there, practicing kindness around that. So that's your basic, get a meditation practice so that you can be aware, because that's the next step. If you're not aware of how you're mistreating yourself, of the voice in your head that's saying the mean things, then you can't change it. Most of the time, people aren't even aware of the dialogue that's happening inside their minds. So having a regular meditation practice helps you to be aware of cultivating that ability to be mindful about what it is you're saying to yourself. So then once you're mindful and you notice, oh my gosh, I'm really, really saying mean things to myself right now, then the simple practice is to stop. Just pause. It doesn't even matter if you're busy. You can still notice and just take a moment and breathe. Just take a couple of deep breaths. Put your hand on your heart if you can, and just say, okay, I acknowledge that I'm saying really hurtful things to myself, and this isn't helpful. And can I send some kindness to pretend that I'm a person that I love? How would what would I say to somebody that I love? And then can you say that to yourself? And then if there's an action that you could take that would be a compassionate thing for you, then can you do that thing? So earlier when I said just stop, put your hand on your heart and say, okay, what's the most compassionate thing I could do for myself right now? And then do that thing. Practice doing those things. Yeah. And taking little moments in your day to just breathe. And people, like I've heard it so many times, oh, breathing doesn't work. Breathing is the key to life, It really does work when you can stop and pause and just take a breath and put your feet on the floor and just be present with yourself. That is a huge thing that you can do that's compassion toward yourself, but it's very simple, but it can be so hard because, like you said earlier, this feeding that thing, we get something out of that. Like we get this energy from it that we can ride for a little while, but then eventually it just wears you down.
Yeah. Yeah, it can feel really good to feel angry for a period of time.
Absolutely.
It can feel.
I'm not saying, go ahead, but then notice what it does to you.
Yeah.
Just notice. And then, okay, now what can I do to counterbalance that? Can I be kind to myself?
So what you're saying here is, and I love what you're saying because it's what, it's my whole life's work. Just have a practice, is have even a small, short meditation practice every day is going to give you some space to get to know yourself better. That's, a lot of what meditation is about is just being still so you can watch the thoughts come and go, so you can watch how you are to yourself. And that has lasting benefits through the day because you'll be more aware during the day. You'll develop that trait of mindfulness. So first, knowing what you're doing to yourself, because if we've been doing this since we were, little kids in many cases,
this just doesn't
so habituated.
You've been doing it already for a really long time.
Right. It can be that self-criticism can be so habituated you don't even see it. Like how often do we really notice the blue in the sky? We have to really consciously think about it. Right. So first is build that practice. Second is when you catch yourself being violent to yourself, being self-critical, being hard on yourself, is to pause. Just take a moment and give it some space. And rather than saying, like, I'm bad for doing this, you don't even need to do that. You don't need to criticize yourself more.
That's the next part that I say. Can you have as much compassion as possible for what you're going through in this moment with as little judgment as possible?
Right. Yeah.
I don't say don't have any, because that's hard to do, but as little judgment as possible. And then the judgment that you're putting on it, can you please notice that and just see what it does?
Yeah.
You just practice with it. And, this is also yoga. It's interesting to me how many people really think that yoga is all about the poses, when the postures themselves are meant to help calm the mind so you can get to a state of meditation. It all goes together. But for people who are physical, the thing you might do instead of sitting is, go for a walk or have a short asana practice, have a sun salutation. Oh my gosh. have just the sun salutation, those 13 poses. And if you don't know what that is, I mean, you can Google that and find it real quick. But it's just these 13 postures that move your body pretty much in all the ways it can move. And at the end of it, you will find that your mind is a little more clear. And you've also done something that's beneficial for the body. So in that way, that's also self-care.
And we could also practice ahimsa to the postures. And as a yoga teacher and yoga therapist, we both know this. And I think particularly in yoga therapy, we are teaching people not to push themselves to the extreme. It's not about achievement. It's about how you're relating to the postures. And so ahimsa in your yoga practice, if you have one, where you notice, when am I being hard on myself here? Mm-hmm. When do I need to give myself some space here?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, ahimsa is a practice that we can do all the time. I mean, you can practice it in terms of any kind of self-criticism, around your work, oh, this isn't good enough. Are you being kind to yourself? Or are you being unduly harsh? Or in your grief, I shouldn't be feeling this way. I should be further down the road. Whatever the thing is, can you practice ahimsa towards yourself there? In your yoga practice with the poses, oh, you don't look like somebody on the cover of Yoga Journal, neither do I. So we do these things, and we have as much kindness towards ourselves with as little judgment, and that's the practice over and over.
Yeah, that Yoga Journal thing, it makes me laugh because I often wonder if they touch up those covers like they do every other magazine cover. I'm sure
of course
they do. So probably the people on the cover of Yoga Journal don't even look like themselves.
No, they don't.
a little levity helps. Yeah.
Yes, but none of us is perfect, and these practices are a practice because you're supposed to keep practicing. Yeah. There's never an end point where you get to this perfection, or at least I don't think I'm going to get there in my lifetime. So who knows how many lifetimes it might take me. But even then, the point is not to strive for that perfection. The point is the practice itself.
Yeah. Well, and the whole goal of all of this is to relieve our suffering. It's the pain of grief will be here. Like you said, 10 years later, 12 and a half years later, you still feel that sadness.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, so there's always this in my life, there's always this person who is integral to my life is gone, and I don't get to see the person he becomes.
Yeah.
There's that. His absence is always present. And then there are the moments that show up where you just kind of fall apart. And this week, I've had some of those moments with some circumstances that have been happening, and I just have had to let myself be in it, because the other choice is to avoid, and I know what that does, and I don't want that. Mm-hmm. So it's like interesting. It took me a lot of years to get to the place. It was probably like year 8 or 9 before I got to this place where really I don't get surprised by it anymore. I'm not surprised by it anymore. It's just really interesting. This is a judgment word. I'm better at letting it be what it is, but it's nice to not be surprised by it anymore. But sometimes it's still just like, oh, there you are again and again and again. I know you're going to show up now. Like I don't get surprised anymore, but it's like, oh, okay. And I know if I don't make the space for it, I'm going to not be later on. I'm going to have a worse day. I'm going to be more irritable. I'm going to feel it in my body somewhere too. And so I know I need to make the space for it.
And maybe we become more comfortable with our discomfort.
Well, yes. And, so talking about yoga, the word asana means a steady, comfortable posture. That's what it means. That doesn't mean you have to be in triangle pose or in, Natarajasana or some Sanskrit word. You can be sitting in your car. You can be watching TV with your family and be able to practice asana in a steady, comfortable posture. And in grief, we very rarely feel steady, and we almost never feel comfortable, especially early on. And the practices of yoga help you to find a place of steadiness and some way of having that comfort and discomfort. And I just love how you can take all these practices of yoga and then apply them to every single thing in your life, which is, I believe, what they're meant to do. It's not just for the yoga mat, but it's not just for your meditation practice. It's for every single moment of your life. Cooking in the kitchen, going to work, being in a board meeting, doing, whatever you do in your life, every moment, being in traffic, dealing with family, dealing with friends. Is this constant practice of, okay, am I being kind to myself? Am I being kind to others? Can I find some comfort in this discomfort? Can I be aware of it? It's just this path of life that helps you manage so many emotions, grief among them, but the challenges of life and the beauty in life and the joy that is also inherent in life, and finding a way to hold those things together at the same time, which for me was like one of the biggest challenges in grief, is being able to say, okay, I don't have to just feel this broken, heart-wrenching pain. I can also feel love alongside that. And then later, I can also feel happiness along with this big hole that's in my life. They don't have to be separate. And that comes with practice. And I think it's a practice that really aids us in moving through all of our life, everything that comes toward us, because you're not just going to have one grief. I mean, you may have, I certainly, with every fiber of my being, hope that the grief I've been through is the worst I'm going to have, but I know I can't control that. And so all these practices help the next time that somebody dies, the next thing that I lose, I'm going to have the ability to manage it better because I'm cultivating this practice. And this is what I teach everybody that I work with. And it starts with Ahimsa. Everything is based on that.
So how can people learn more about this? I know this is such a short period of time to dive into all that is yoga for grief and loss. And sure. I mean, I mentioned the book, and for those of you who are watching, not listening, I'm holding up the book, Yoga for Grief and Loss by Karla Helbert. But how else can we find you, and what else are you working on?
Well, you're welcome to please visit the website, and you can sign up for my newsletter on there. And there's a link where if you sign up, you can also get, there's a free 23-page ebook on there that has a lot of breathing practices and mindfulness practices. And it's about helping to stay steady. So you can get that if you sign up for the newsletter. But also when you get the newsletter, you get to hear about workshops that I'm doing and retreats that I facilitate and help facilitate as well. You can also, there's the new book that's coming out. So if you really want to learn about yoga for grief and loss, please read the book. And, if you don't have to buy the book. I mean, you can go to the library and say, hey, do you guys have this book? And if they don't, ask them to have it for you. It is a really good book. I mean, really, I'm not just saying that because I wrote it, but it really is the book I wish I had had. Like Oprah said, write the book you want to read. It really is the book I wish I had had when my son died. And it's helpful. And it's in small chunks. So like there's no more, like each section is like 2 or 3 pages because you don't need to get overwhelmed. But then the new book that's coming out, which rose from the yoga book, in the Tantra chapter, I started talking about the chakras, which are, for people who don't know, the chakras are these energetic centers in our body. They're a lot more than that, but the chakra is a Sanskrit word that means wheel or disc. And classically, the chakras are seen as these energetic spaces that help to regulate a lot of things and interact and interface with our emotions and also with our physical body. But how those things are impacted in grief and trauma. And it really, there's not another book like it. So it talks about how each one of the chakras are affected in grief and trauma. And then there's tons of meditations and journaling practices and art prompts and visualizations around each one of the chakras and practices for helping us get in touch with the energies around each of those and working with the energy in each of the chakra bodies, and have balance is the key, helping to balance what's happening, because in grief and trauma we get super off balance, and that's okay because that's normal. But the practice is then, how can I come to homeostasis and help myself get back in balance? And you don't stay that way. It's an ongoing practice.
Life keeps happening, right?
Exactly. So my website is just karlahelbert.com.
Okay. Karla Helbert, and that's KarlaHelbert.com.
Yes.
And I have read Yoga for Grief and Loss, and I too can recommend it. I think it's a great book both for bereaved people and yoga therapists and grief therapists. It's the right balance between your story, yoga philosophy, and grief theory. It's a book I would have wanted to write too for myself.
Well, your stuff is pretty good too.
We're both sharing those same teachings, and you are such a heartful, wonderful person. Just the fact that you're like, you don't need to buy it, just go to the library. That shows you just want to help people, and I think that's why we connect so well. You just want to. You've been through it and you want to help people suffer less. And that's really what I receive is your intention for offering this. And those who get to work with you are very lucky and very blessed. So thank you. Well, thank you so much for taking time out to share this with our listeners and viewers. And is there anything else you want to say to feel complete for now?
I don't think so. I think we've covered a lot of stuff, and I hope so. For people who aren't familiar with these concepts, that it wasn't too much of Sanskrit and a lot of not a lot of theory, but I know there can be so much of this that's overwhelming. But really, just coming back to this one thing of what can I do right now to be more compassionate toward myself, and how can I help myself to be more aware of how I'm really treating myself. I mean, that is the core. I realized, I guess I should have known this already, but the other day I just realized really the core of everything I teach and do is around self-compassion.
Yeah.
And being kinder to yourself in the midst of probably the biggest storm you've been through thus far. And what you need is some kindness. So I think we covered that.
I think we did cover it.
Thank
you for helping distill what can be a challenging task of learning how to be kind to ourselves down into a very simple practice of basically pausing, paying attention, and then just kind of shifting the internal conversation. So
not
easy, but simple. Simple, right. Not easy, but doable. It just takes practice.
Yes, it's practice.
Yeah. Thank you
so much, Heather.
Oh, thank you, Karla. Namaste.
Namaste.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Mindfulness and Grief Podcast. If you found what you heard useful, please consider rating, reviewing, or subscribing to our podcast on iTunes, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts. For more grief support, please visit our website at mindfulnessandgrief.com, where you will find free guided meditations, supportive articles, and online courses and groups. Special thanks to our sound engineer, Todd Campbell, and to the Atomic Mosquitoes for the opening and closing music. I'm Heather Stang, and I hope these teachings will be of great benefit to all who receive them. Until next time, namaste.